Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with the daily update for August 25th, 2021. Well, yesterday there was a G7 ambush set up to try to convince Joe Biden to extend the U.S. presence in Afghanistan. Now, Biden is operating under a constraint imposed by Taliban, which is insisting that the U.S. stick to the agreement to take the troops out of the Kabul airport by August 31st. There's an extensive airlift underway. It's quite chaotic. There's no guarantee they'll be done. But the question is, what was the intent of the British in particular to keep the U.S. in Afghanistan longer? Now, the reality is you have a toothless Britain snapping at the United States. It's clear from a number of statements that the British are completely unhinged by the U.S. decision to end the war there, because it exposes the Boris Johnson policy of global Britain as nothing but a public relations exercise to cover for a continued imperial presence, imperial control of strategic and financial policy globally. That's all global Britain really is. You know, the idea that the British have the power, the military power, the financial power to dictate terms has depended in the recent period on the U.S. relying on this idea of a special relationship to back up the British. Now, it's clear from the statements that have come out that the promoters of this idea are beginning to see that it's not acceptable, at least at present, to the United States, where the majority of the U.S. population wants to end these wars. That doesn't mean that the population wants chaos. It doesn't mean they want to see attacks on the people of Afghanistan. But that enough is enough. We've been there 20 years. There's no enhancement of U.S. security by remaining longer. There's no guarantee that there'll be a better situation in Afghanistan just by keeping troops there. The solution, as we've pointed out, is to engage the neighbors of Afghanistan and the major powers like Russia and China in particular, but also India, with the United States to put forward a development policy which could transform Afghanistan into a modern economy. If you don't do something like that, then you're leaving a situation in potential chaos in which a vacuum will eventually be filled by bad actors. So either we make the correct decision to get out and engage in that kind of diplomacy, or it continue in an endless war that will never be resolved. And so in that sense, Biden did what Trump said he wanted to do, and it was the legitimate response. But listen to the Brits. I've quoted some of these recently. I just want to bring a few more of them back up. Andrew Ronsley of The Observer said, and this is crucial to this idea of global Britain, he said, the UK has lots of vital interests around the globe, but not the means to safeguard them by itself. In other words, we need American muscle to continue the empire. Then there's Lord Kim Darroch, someone who has, the only thing you can say about him is a lot of chutzpah. He was the ambassador of the United Kingdom to the United States during the Trump period, when he talked about using Trump whisperers to flood the zone to convince Trump to go to war in Syria. And Darroch, at the same time, was sending back messages about how Trump was dysfunctional, the government is chaotic, but he said we can control it through the use of Trump whisperers by flooding the zone. And he had to leave because of his memos were leaked to the British press. But what Darroch said is that, quote, global Britain was an interesting and potentially lucrative, sensible path for the UK to go on. What does he mean by potentially lucrative? It's the empire. It's the free trade agreements. It's the British control of trade in a globalized system, which requires U.S. military and financial muscle to back it up. That's done. And so then he comments on the reduction of spending by the British government on military, the lack of favorable trade deals. And then he says, as a result, we have rather passively acquiesced in the foreign policy disaster that is the Afghan withdrawal. And he said it will take quite a long time to recover from all of this, to recover our reputation. What reputation? The reputation as an imperial nation, as an imposer of neo-colonial financial policy, and the ability to deploy forces to impose that. That's something worth defending. Then you have Lord Peter Ricketts, the former chairman of the Joint Intelligence Committee when Blair was Prime Minister. Remember, that was the Joint Intelligence Committee which combined with MI6 to spread the lies about Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction. And here's what he said. He said, the Afghan crisis has exposed the delusions of grandeur of global Britain. And he said that the belief was that the special relationship would allow the United Kingdom to, quote, shape the international order of the future, unquote. Of course, Blair, the leading war criminal, laments that the forever wars can be ended due to public pressure. Now, the real issue, as we've been reporting, that's posed by the debacle at the end of the Afghan war is to define the true national strategic interests of the United States, of a sovereign U.S., and it does not depend on an unlimited commitment to carry on endless wars, imperial wars. Now, meanwhile, there are other traps being set. There was a conference in Kiev yesterday called the Crimea Platform Summit, called by President Zelensky. It included most of the NATO countries, the U.S. and others were there. And it's an attempt to build support for a Ukrainian drive to reclaim the Crimea. Zelensky in his speech said Russia has trampled on the rights and freedoms of people in Crimea. In response, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov pointed out that there are new laws just passed in Kiev which oppose the rights of the ethnic minorities that are Russian and Hungarian living in Ukraine. And he called the conference in Kiev, quote, a coven where the West will continue to groom neo-Nazi and racist attitudes of the current Ukrainian authorities. Well, that's an obvious point because the West still refuses to acknowledge the presence of neo-Nazi security forces inside the Ukrainian Defense Department, and that these are the forces that refuse to abide by the Minsk agreements, which could end the conflict in eastern Ukraine. At the same time, we have the hapless Vice President Harris on her Asian tour, which is part of the strategy to bring about the Obama pivot to Asia, the geopolitical doctrine to basically isolate China and to undermine the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, Harris is spouting out a lot of rhetoric, but has nothing to back it up. She charged China with acting to, quote, undermine the rules-based order and threaten the sovereignty of nations, unquote. It's kind of rich, given what's happening now in Afghanistan, where the rules-based order has itself been exposed as an arbitrary set of rules that are designed to impose military penalties to countries that don't acquiesce to the U.S., British, NATO military and financial policies, including now the Great Reset, the idea that developing countries have no right to develop, that we must impose a Green New Deal. That's the new rules-based order. And here's Harris lecturing the Chinese at a point at which the U.S. has nothing to offer, having pulled back from the Afghan conflict, but still looking for confrontation with Russia and China in Ukraine and the Crimea, and then also in the Indo-Pacific. Now, a Chinese foreign ministry spokesman said the obvious. He said, what's happening in Afghanistan now reveals what the rules-based order is. It's accept the U.S. right to military intervene in support of arbitrary rules of international financial oligarchy. Well, that's absolutely right. The Afghan debacle should mean an end to this kind of rules-based order and replace it with an era of cooperation for economic development and mutual benefit, which would end forever the colonial policies which have been imposed by military force and brutal austerity by the international banks for the last 4 centuries. This is the opportunity we have in front of us. Are we going to listen to the hapless, toothless British screaming about their global Britain? Or are we going to pursue the national sovereign interests of the United States? That's what's at stake here. And the idea that Biden should be impeached for pulling out, well, perhaps the way it was done was not the best way, but pulling out is in the national interest of the United States. We should have done this 10, 15, maybe even 18 years ago. So thanks for joining me. I'll be back again tomorrow.